From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. Has India's time come? That's tonight on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Dr. Alyssa Ayres, Senior Fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. She served as U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia from 2010 to 2013. More than 25 years' experience in India and South Asia. It crosses government, nonprofit, and private sectors. She served as a project director for 2 bipartisan task forces on U.S.-India relations, co-edited 3 books on India and Indian foreign policy, and her book on nationalism in Pakistan, Speaking Like a State, was published in 2009. And her new book, just out, Our Time Has Come, How India is Making Its Place in the World. Welcome, Alyssa. Good to have you on.
Very happy to join. Thanks for having me.
And I've been very interested in this show because I know little about India, I'm embarrassed to admit, and most of the U.S. seems to. I do know about IT, though, because I was in systems integration. We did a lot of work with offshoring work with India. And,
absolutely.
Very talented in the IT sphere. India's emerging. Where in the world, power order is India moving into?
Well, we could take that question economically. The IMF, they revise their data every 6 months or so, and their April revision came out. It turns out the Indian economy at market exchange rates has now surpassed the size of the French economy. By some estimates, the Indian economy may surpass the size of the UK economy by the end of this calendar year. That would make India the world's 5th largest economy. And I think most Americans aren't aware of that. I think we are used to thinking about India as a land of poverty or a place that has many, many challenges, which of course it does. I don't mean to minimize that. But at the very same time, this country really is emerging economically on the world stage in a much more central way than I think we've been used to thinking about. So you could certainly say that India's time has come economically.
In fact,
now, if we were to ask, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in fact, in your book, you say they should be third in GDP within 15 years, which is, blows me away. Let me ask you.
Right.
Let me ask you this: why now for this book, and what's your connection to India?
Well, I've been working on India in foreign policy and as a scholar for a couple decades now, and I felt that I wanted to write a book for an American reader who might be tracking foreign policy issues but not looking closely at India. In many ways, India is not kind of on the general central radar screen when it comes to thinking about U.S. foreign policy priorities. Yeah. China occupies a big space. Europe, of course, our transatlantic allies, crises in the Middle East. India is not a crisis, and it's not a long-standing ally, so it kind of falls between those two extremes. It is also true that successive Indian leaders, it's not just with the new Prime Minister Modi, but India's previous Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and the Prime Minister before that, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, India's Prime Ministers have seen their country aspiring to a central role as one of several world powers. And I do think that the country is getting ever closer to that ambition. And so that's the kind of scenario I felt like there was a moment to write a little bit more about.
Do you think that as part of the developing world, that India is really a model for democracy? I think of Iraq. I think of even China's more authoritarian version. What do you think?
There's a lot of debate in India. There's actually a big debate in India right now about whether the current government is too authoritarian in their approach. But it's an interesting thing. Very, very vigorous public debate, a very active NGO community, very active media. And India has, a democracy against the odds and maintained this democracy with one brief exception over these decades of its 70 years of independence. So there's a lot there in terms of India's experience with democracy, its ability to provide advice to other countries that are struggling with their own democratic issues. So I think there's actually a positive story to tell here. By saying that, I don't mean to imply that India is perfect. Mm-hmm. Like many democracies, including our own, India has a lot of challenges. And make no mistake, there's a very vigorous debate about that within India, too.
All right, let me ask you this in terms of some bad news. This rape and murder of an 8-year-old Muslim girl has raised, in India, has raised sort of a big stink. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, this is a very, very disturbing story. It's not the only story you'll read in India about violence against women. It's not the first time this happened, and in fact, there's been a series of stories about violence against women and girls. This particular case tapped into religious divisions as well.
Yeah.
It tapped into some other debates around whether the Indian government is standing up to condemn these types of problems when they occur, when violence against Muslim minority citizens of the country occur. But on the question of violence against women, this is an issue that is something that India has been struggling with for some time. You may recall in 2012 there was a quite well-known, it rose to international headlines, very violent gang rape of a young physiotherapy student on a bus in Delhi, and she eventually passed away due to the injuries that she suffered in this rape. It was just a horrible thing. That galvanized a kind of protest movement in India for a greater focus on violence against women and ensuring that this doesn't happen. So you do see actually at the same time that this very disturbing violence does take place, you also have a community of people who are standing up and saying this cannot continue in our society. We have to do something about that. So there are a lot of calls in India for criminal justice, law enforcement reform. Mm-hmm. This is a very important issue in India, absolutely.
Another issue is there's been these episodes of shortage of ATM cash, and there was a demonetization in 2016. What is all that about?
Yeah. So the Indian government thought that one way to try to combat what they refer to as black money, which is a form of criminal activity taking place in the informal economy through cash channels only, they thought that one way to try to combat this would be to eliminate certain denominations of the Indian rupee currency and replace it with new currency. Now, in and of itself, I don't know if this would have solved the problem of criminal enterprise being conducted on the black market in cash. But one of the problems of implementing this plan was that the new currency notes weren't properly sized for the ATMs, so there was a problem getting enough notes into them and calibrating the ATMs in time, and so that gets to the situation you led with, where there was these mass shortages of cash all across the country. Well, about 90% of India's economy employment is in the informal sector, people in a cash economy, so that caused cascading effects around the country. The effects of this demonetization lasted for about a year or so. India is only beginning to come out of the economic dip that the country went into as a result of this and as a result of the implementation of a new, like a value-added tax, a goods and services tax that the country implemented in the summer of 2017. But the demonetization and the ATM cash shortages has been a very interesting experiment. I think it's probably going to be looked back upon as a failure in terms of combating the illegal activity, but probably has nudged the Indian economy much more towards digitization. So that could, in the medium or longer term, be a positive.
All right, we got about a minute and a half to go in this segment. I want to start talking about some of the major changes. I was stunned at how fast and the huge numbers, the rise of the middle class there.
Well, yeah. I think for many people in India, their middle class isn't growing fast enough. And some of the latest data coming out suggests that as people are moving out of poverty, they are moving into lower income and not moving fast enough into the middle class. But that's all a way of saying that there is momentum of people coming out of poverty and gaining prosperity, and that's a very, very positive thing. over time, the scale of India is enormous, like China. So you're going to see very large middle class over time. At the moment, estimates of the size of India's middle class vary anywhere from 30 million to 270 million people, depending on how you define the threshold entry for middle class.
Listen to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the station nearest to you, listen over the internet, get our podcast. We'll be right back. More on some of the big changes in India. And we're back with Dr. Alyssa Ayres from the Council on Foreign Relations, expert on India. Back to the middle class, the other side of that, which I found pretty amazing, is there are 262 million people living in poverty, which is almost the size of the United States.
Right. Well, any number that you look at in India on almost any issue is going to be just enormous.
Jeez.
You look at the size of the populations of India's huge cities, something like 18, 20 million people in the greater region around New Delhi and the surrounding cities, or 18 million people in Mumbai. 262 million people still living below the World Bank extreme poverty threshold of $1.90 per day. So that's a struggle, and India has been focused and will continue to need to focus on economic growth and finding ways to create jobs and good livelihoods for this huge population. Let me just give you another number, not as big, but still significant. 160 million people. 160 million people have moved out of extreme poverty in India over, let's say, the past decade.
That's stunning to me. Yeah.
That's stunning. I know. It's an incredible thing. It's between 2004-05 and 2011-2012. That's when the World Bank has the cutoff dates. So you can see there is progress.
How about this statistic? I'm from Chicago originally. Their urban influx, folks moving from the rural to the urban, is adding equivalent of a Chicago per year.
That's the McKinsey Institute statistic. I find that so vivid. It's just expressing it in that way. The need to build an infrastructure on the order of a Chicago. I mean, it's an absolutely incredible thing. And that gets to some of the priorities that are so important for India's leaders, India's political leaders, its city managers, its business leaders. I mean, when you've got this level of change happening right before your very eyes, it places a high priority on getting things done. And it's not always easy to get things done in India, and so that's where the country can struggle. That remains an issue in India.
And the population may surpass China by 2025. Is that right?
Sometime before 2025, India's population is likely to grow slightly larger than China's. It's also the case that India's population is much younger than China's, and will remain young until around 2040, 2050, while China, Japan, Western Europe are all aging.
What about the caste system? In the U.S., we always heard about that, and you're stuck down there, you can't get out. How is that changing?
Well, my book doesn't focus on this issue in any particular way, but this is a very important social issue in India. Certainly, caste continues to exist. Economic growth has offered the opportunity for many people to have more mobility than would have been the case previously, but caste does still continue to exist. You can see its existence by opening the classified pages and looking at the matrimonial sections of any newspaper, where people will be advertising their interest in finding a bride or a groom of, X specific caste. So it's definitely still a feature.
Let's put India on the couch here for a second. You've had an inward-focused country. You had a country that was very socialist. Now there's pressure for the markets. There's pressure to integrate and become a global leader. Nehru and Gandhi sort of had a split psyche on what to do. Is there a lack of consensus, or is this going to help them stub their toes or whatever?
Well, I like to think of it as economic reform in India is a gradual process. And in 1991, India faced a balance of payments crisis, and the government of the day, that was a Congress-led government. Interestingly, the finance minister of the time ended up becoming India's prime minister in 2004, Dr. Manmohan Singh. India began a process of economic reform in 1991, and facing that moment of crisis, they liberalized many aspects of the economy. They removed a lot of restrictions that limited the size of industries, didn't allow them to grow. They deregulated a lot of different industries. They took some industries and allowed them to become private as opposed to just government-controlled. India continued to have 5-year plans, though. The 5-year planning process lasted until 2014. The Modi government came in and actually did away with what was called the Planning Commission that created 5-year plans for the Indian economy. So that's been a change. But, I've described a place that has been liberalizing. It still has a lot of controls on the economy. There are different sectors of the economy that face restrictions in foreign direct investment. When India liberalizes, it doesn't always open up everything all at once, otherwise there wouldn't be this conversation. It's kind of a gradual process. Somebody will take an executive action to say, okay, we'll liberalize foreign direct investment in, courier services, and then a law will be passed to liberalize foreign direct investment in insurance, but only to a 26% cap. So you can see these incremental changes. Yeah. There's always some issue that different industry segments will be saying, well, we need more liberalization to help in this space.
All right, now explain to us how politics works over there. There's 2 major parties, but there's tons of parties. And you say in the book that we're used to looking at things in the States now as left-wing and right-wing. That doesn't fit India?
That's exactly what I say. Because, well, first, there's 2 reasons I said that. First of all, the most, what we consider left-wing in the United States has a lot to do with an economic theory of how much the government should be involved in the economy, correct? Well, even India's most right-wing parties still think the government should have a large role in the economy. So that's not the best metric to, the best metaphor to talk about where parties are situated. In India, these tend to be much more cultural arguments, actually. But there are many parties. You have kind of two major national parties, but you actually have 6 parties that are considered national because they have a presence in more than 2 states. The 2 major national parties are, of course, the current party that's in power in the central government. The people call it the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which means the Indian People's Party, and the Congress Party, which is the party of Gandhi and Nehru and the party that led India to independence. That's the party that's now being led by Nehru's grandson, Rahul Gandhi. The Congress Party for decades, and I write about this in the book and in the historical background section, the Congress Party was dominant in the country for decades after India's independence. And only in recent years have you seen that the current party in power in the central government, the BJP, has begun to gain power at the state level across India. So the BJP has now picked up states across the entire country, and this is unprecedented.
What's the level of corruption?
Well, how do you measure that? India still struggles with problems of corruption. This is a major political issue in almost every state in India, and certainly for the national government. The current government came into power by arguing that they would be free of corruption as opposed to the previous government, which had a number of corruption scandals while they were in office. This is a very live issue in India.
Foreign investment side, is it good enough encouraging investment yet?
The Indian government is actively pursuing foreign investment in India and very actively pursuing foreign companies to come locate manufacturing facilities in India. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy to operate there. There's always going to be some hitches in the process, but they are very, very focused on trying to encourage more manufacturing, more investment to help kick the Indian economy into much higher gear.
We'll be right back. Challenges facing India. And we're back. Alyssa Ayres, the book is Our Time Has Come, How India is Making Its Place in the World. I'll go through some of these challenges now, and hopefully you can explain a little bit. First off, what is Hindu majoritarianism as an issue? What does that mean?
Well, it means that India is a largely Hindu country. About, say, 80% of the population is Hindu. About 14% is Muslim. You have some other smaller percentages of religions represented in India: Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism, Christianity as well. But in many ways, the party that is currently now in power, both with the central government and in many state governments now, as we discussed, they have been concerned that previous Indian governments, they talk about this under what they call the guise of secularism or pseudo-secularism, had made too many concessions to India's religious minorities in an unfair way. So there are now questions about how to manage diversity, religious diversity in India, and what that means. At the extreme end, there are some fringe figures, many of whom support the current prime minister, but some of whom have advocated violence against minorities, and that is a real problem. Now, the prime minister doesn't speak out frequently about these problems of violence against minorities. I personally wish he would. I think if you ask Indian leaders, they'll say this is a country of 1 billion-plus people. The prime minister can't speak about every instance of violence. But part of the problem is that it seems to create an atmosphere where fringe figures feel more empowered. So that's something that is a very live and active debate in India right now. Such a diverse, enormous country with so many different kinds of communities represented, and what's the best way to maintain the safety and security for everyone in a fair way.
How's India doing on pollution and climate change?
Well, it is struggling still with pollution. On climate change, it is taking some very dramatic steps to scale up its renewable energy, and that has been a quite amazing story to watch. Let me just say on the pollution front, India is really suffering from a lot of air quality problems. It used to be that people thought China had the worst air quality problems in the world. I think now India, many Indian cities, including New Delhi, which has very, very bad air quality problems, that's taken over the top spot according to recent World Health Organization measurements. So India's had trouble figuring out how to tackle the air quality issues, the air pollution issues. On the other hand, as it looks ahead on some of its overall carbon emissions questions and its overall energy security, it has sought to ramp up its use of solar energy, of wind energy, and of other kinds of fractional renewable, like let's call them biomass materials. So India's got this huge solar energy ramp up, just absolutely enormous in scale, $100 billion in scale, ramping up to 100 gigawatts of solar energy capacity by 2022. That's the ambition, and they're moving very quickly on that front. So that is a very interesting kind of new phenomenon of the last 5 years in India.
All right, I want to talk about a couple threats now. First, Pakistan. And that's been a constant issue. And then they're an issue for the U.S. They're so double-faced on supporting the Taliban and telling us they're supporting us. Is that ever fixable? And what's sort of the status of Pakistan and India?
The immediate status, there's a little bit of news that was just announced, which is that India and Pakistan have agreed to re-implement a ceasefire agreement along the line of control in Kashmir that was effective for some time, and then gradually was no longer observed, and so there's been an uptick in firing along the line of control. So that is actually a positive development in recent days, but it's certainly the case that it's hard to see a solution to the enmity and the cycles of violence between India and Pakistan. There used to be a standing what was called a composite dialogue. That dialogue has fallen apart. In part because the current Indian government has just said very bluntly, we cannot talk to you, Pakistan, while there are terrorist attacks being waged against our country. And you can at least I sympathize with that position. It's indeed pretty hard to talk with a country and have a serious negotiation if there's going to be a terrorist attack. India's had several cycles of different negotiations, and then 3 weeks later, a terrible terrorist attack. So that has been an issue. Can this be solved? Is there ever a way for India and Pakistan to solve their differences? I think that would happen really coming through change within Pakistan itself. I would note one example, which has been kind of off the radar screen in the United States, but Bangladesh was part of Pakistan until 1971. Bangladesh and India haven't always had the easiest relationship, and they had what was the world's most complicated border. Islands of extraterritoriality, just a very, very complicated border. They managed to resolve their border issues after more than 70 years. They solved their border issues, reached agreement in December 2014, exchanged territory in 2015, and that's now done. So is it possible for countries that have had decades of disagreements over border issues or difficult problems that cannot be resolved to actually overcome those problems? Yes, it is.
Now, I think Pakistan and India both have nukes. Should India join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
No, Indian leaders have written about this at length, including in a quite famous article that appeared in Foreign Affairs in 1998, written by India's foreign minister at the time, and the title was called Against Nuclear Apartheid. India's leaders believe that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty discriminates by creating categories of nuclear haves and have-nots. And India has not wanted to be in the have-not category, which they would have to be in because they tested after the cutoff date. And so that's why they haven't wanted to sign. So Pakistan is not part of this issue. India, interestingly, has changed all of its domestic laws, strengthened them on the export control front, and has now become a member of the Missile Technology Control Regime, of the Australia Group and the Wassenaar Arrangement. These are technical non-proliferation regimes that govern dual-use items and chemical items. And they've applied for membership in the Nuclear Suppliers Group. They are already allowed to trade with the members of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. That means trade in nuclear commerce, like purchasing uranium or something. This is all part of the result of the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement that the George W. Bush administration began and that the Obama administration continued. So actually, India has been doing a lot in terms of strengthening its own credentials as a country protecting non-proliferation. I just don't think they're ever going to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Yeah.
Let's move to China. I'm interested to see who you think is making the right moves here. China has just, put Xi in for president for life and all that, and it is more authoritarian. They're both sort of in this hyper-economic development mode. Talk about the two of them, their competition, et cetera.
A lot of people think that the big competition in this region, the big security competition, is India and Pakistan. And I think that the big competition here is between India and China.
Interesting.
These are, again, you could take the description of two nuclear-armed neighbors. Well, India and China are also two nuclear-armed neighbors. When India tested nuclear devices in 1998, the Indian defense minister at the time spoke about an encircling enemy. He wasn't talking about Pakistan. He was talking about China. India has seen China's expansion into the Indian Ocean region, China's use of economic statecraft to create infrastructure investments for many of the small countries that surround India, creating a deep water port in Pakistan at Gwadar. This is now apparently going to be used as a Chinese almost military base. China now has an active military base in Djibouti. China has a very deep investment relationship with Sri Lanka. India looks at all this and thinks, well, wait a minute, what's happening in its own region?
Are those anti-India moves? I know
India
they appear to be.
perceives it that way. India perceives it that way. And so that is how it is thinking about its own security scenario. In many ways, India has responded by trying to strengthen its own relationships with these countries in the region. It has a better relationship with Sri Lanka now than it did 10 years ago. That's in part because of a change in government in Sri Lanka. It has improved its relationship with Bangladesh. Its relations with Maldives have not gone as well. Maldives now has an authoritarian in power who has really cozied up to China, put a lot of Democrats in the Maldives in prison. India has been pretty vocal about that issue. So, India in many ways feels as if it's on the back foot in terms of influence in its region, as China has seemingly unending capital to be able to just lavish on these smaller countries.
Listen to Business Talk with Jim Campbell from our flagship stations, Yale Radio, WYBC, and WGCH Greenwich. And we're back for our final national segment, talking with Dr. Alyssa Ayres, expert on India. Now, the book is Our Time. How do you see this playing out in the near future? What is their level of ambition, and where do you see India in 25 years?
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about India and global institutions, and I think that's India's big challenge. India is doing a lot economically. India can do things to help spur its economy, its economic growth, what it can do internally. What it is struggling with is gaining access to some of these institutions on the world stage that are, where the powerful countries conduct diplomacy. Yeah. Take the UN Security Council. India has sought a permanent seat on the UN Security Council for years. India's argument would be that it's the world's largest democracy. It has been historically the top troop contributor to UN peacekeeping over the decades. It's very active in all the different UN institutions, but it doesn't have that seat at the high table. By the way, the United States has an official foreign policy of supporting Indian membership in a reformed and expanded Security Council. It's just a little hard to see that reform happening in the near term. But there's other organizations that India has sought membership in, and it's been locked out, like the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC. It's a pretty important organization focused on, committing to expand free trade and investment. This year's summit host for the APEC summit is Papua New Guinea, which has an economy of about $20 billion. And here's India with a $2.6 trillion economy knocking on the door for 20 years and can't gain access. So, it's hard for India. There's a whole host of other organizations we could talk about.
How about the OECD?
Yeah, I've written about that. The OECD is an organization where there's a lot of discussion, dialogue, cooperation, exchange on things like development assistance, international finance, export subsidies. Now, India participates in some of these gatherings, but not as a member. And part of the problem with not being a member of the OECD is that then prevents India from becoming a formal member of the International Energy Agency. This is a huge energy consumer. India is the number 3 energy consumer in the world and could become the number 2 shortly. Can't be a formal member for these arcane reasons. So, it's as if all these institutions that were created in the 20th century just haven't adjusted properly to the changing world scenario and figured out ways to let new countries become members.
Okay, let's talk about U.S.-India relations. You have some ideas on how to improve those. And I was surprised to find out that India only votes with the U.S. 33% of the time in the UN.
Yeah, it's not a good track record.
No.
I definitely would admit that. And I think we're not likely to see India voting with the United States on many issues. And I don't think that should be our benchmark. That really should not be our benchmark because it's a very independent country. And we will be chronically disappointed if we think that them agreeing with us all the time is the only way we'll be able to partner. That is just the fact.
What do you suggest that we should? How should we structure the relationship or improve it?
I've written about this in business terms, that we ought to be thinking about the relationship with India more like a joint venture in business, where you've got some clear areas of cooperation that you can partner with in a very deep joint way. But there's going to be some other areas that aren't part of that cooperation where we won't see eye to eye. We don't see eye to eye on Iran. We don't see eye to eye on Russia. we don't see eye to eye on some sovereignty issues around the world. So knowing and accepting that and doing the most we can where we know we've got great opportunity and potential, I think, is the way to move ahead. If I can just elaborate on one more thing, I think very often Americans tend to view the world as our allies or our enemies.
Yeah.
And India is not interested in being an ally. India sees the alliance relationships the United States has with other countries, and it sees those relationships as one where the other country is subordinate to U.S. interests, and it is not interested in having that role. It is a very, very independent country. I think it would be an independent foreign policy under any Indian government dispensation. So I don't think this is unique to the current government or the most recent Indian government. I think that is the way the country sees itself and its role in the world. So I think that's just part of what we have to factor in as we figure out the most productive ways to partner together with this enormous and very independent country.
Now, they've always been non-aligned. Are they tilted to Russia still, or are they just as independent there, too?
So they've moved a little bit away from the earlier phase of non-alignment. They helped create the non-aligned movement, as you know. Prime Minister Modi is the first Indian prime minister to just not attend the NAM summit. He just didn't go last year, just decided to skip it. But India still has a very strong relationship with Russia, and I don't think they plan to scale that back in any way. That Russia has been a friend to India over the decades and supported it in its times of trouble when the United States was not on the scene for India, and I think they will always remember that.
Now,
He has a very close relationship with Iran, too. I should also note that Japan is a very, very important partner and very close partner of India. Very close. There's a lot of cooperation between India, Japan, and the United States in a trilateral format, too.
in ways of improving or getting India more on the radar within the U.S., you talk about greater student exchange and funding for India studies. Are there other ideas?
Well, I think those are some pretty important ideas. I sure do worry about that. I have some data in the book where drawing upon the study abroad data that the Institute for International Exchange does in their surveys every year. You know, you look at where U.S. students are going to study abroad, it wouldn't surprise anybody to know that U.S. students overwhelmingly go to the U.K., but you have to go pretty far down this list to find India as the destination. And, you know, the way I like to frame this is that twice as many American students go study abroad in Costa Rica as decide to go to India.
Wow.
Now, I know Costa Rica's close. I'm sure a lot of people go to Costa Rica to study environmental issues. It has a lot happening there on the environmental front. But, you know, India is a rising power and a really interesting place, and I just wish more American students were spending that study abroad time there. You can make the same case on the issue of Indian language study. Very, very low enrollment data compared to where you'd expect to see it.
All right, we're down to about a minute. Are you optimistic about where India will be in 25 years?
I am indeed optimistic about where India will be. I don't want this to create the impression that I think that saying that India has arrived on the world stage in many ways means that it's solved all of its problems. It hasn't. I think it's going to continue having to work to solve its problems, and that will be part of its unique story as we head into the next decades.
That was a quick tour of India. Fast hour. Thanks to Alyssa Ayres. The book is Our Time Has Come, How India is Making Its Place in the World. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. You can get our podcast on YouTube as well. Search Business Talk with Jim Campbell or Park City Productions 06604. Great thanks to Dr. Alyssa Ayres from the Council of Foreign Relations. Thanks to our national audience for listening. We'll see everybody again next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.
Money, 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 money. You gotta have it. When you need it, what do? If you don't have a rich uncle, call Lending Tree. With us, hundreds of banks compete for your business, so you'll get loans with competitive interest rates, and in some cases, with no closing costs. So here's the deal. If you need money, call us. Do you want to refinance your current loan? Are you 62 or older and interested in a reverse mortgage? Then call Lending Tree now. 888-794-1645, 888-794-1645. We've closed over $250 billion in loans. We know what we're doing and can help you. Call right now for a free quote. 888-794-1645. 888-794-1645. 888-794-1645. That's 888-794-1645. NMLS number 1136.
And welcome now to our segment 5, which is Overtime. It's exclusively for Yale Radio. How China's authoritarianism is undermining its rise, a contrarian look inside China. That's tonight on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Carl Minzer is a professor of law at Fordham University Law School. He's an expert in Chinese law and governance and has written extensively on these topics in both academic journals and the popular press, this one designed for the popular media. His new book, End of an Era, How China's Authoritarian Revival is Undermining Its Rise. And welcome from Fordham, Carl. How are you?
Very good. Thanks so much for having me on the show, Jim.
No, it's our honor. I'm particularly impressed how able you were to get inside the psyche and the DNA of China, which obviously we're going to talk about later. And I want to ask first off, what's your perspective on these tariffs that the President Trump has just put on, 25% steel, 10% aluminum, and really targeted at China? What are your thoughts?
Well, certainly it looks to me like we're seeing an era in which, the conflicts between the United States and China over trade are likely to heat up. Trump does seem to be pivoting away from an era in which the United States was interested in free trade and multinational accords. It seems to be likely to ramp up conflict with China on this, in the short term.
Do you think that there's a big threat of retaliation from them, making it a zero-sum game? And with that, the Chinese are estimated through intellectual property theft and espionage affecting us negatively to the tune of $300 billion a year. Is that the real issue?
I certainly think that it's likely that China is going to. It's hard for me to imagine how if Trump went through with a series of tariffs, the Chinese aren't likely to just take that line down. They're likely to come back with something. On what subject, I don't know. Would it be hitting soybeans? Would it be hitting? I suspect they'll sort of pick something that's going to be aimed at sending a political message to Trump's base and Republican congressmen. But specifically what they would go after, I don't know.
Okay. China's always had this long-term focus, and the question is whether it's 2030 or 2050, would they surpass us in GDP? We have a very short-term focus. Does it matter if they surpass us, do you think? And before we get into your thesis, are they maybe not going to pass us?
Well, I think there are a couple different questions about that. I mean, one, and the one I'm on my book, is sort of what's happening domestically in China. What's the politically, ideologically, and economically, what's going on in terms of the shifts that are taking place in China at this moment. And I think that I am seeing some fundamental changes in the political norms that have governed China since the early 1970s, since the late 1970s, early 1980s, that make me worried about the stability of the system going forward. China is also experiencing big economic shifts. I think it is secularly starting to slow down. It's following on the same trajectory that Japan and South Korea and Taiwan have gone through. It's possible that China may surpass the United States in terms of overall GDP. It's going to be a very long time before it even comes remotely close to approaching the United States in per capita GDP.
Yes.
But I think the really big thing to watch is some of the political changes that are starting to take place in China right now, because they're really different from what we've seen over the last 40 years.
That leads to the obvious first question. President Xi Jinping, is he president for life now?
It certainly looks like he's setting himself up in that direction. I mean, since the late 1970s, early 1980s, China, unlike the Maoist era, had pursued a policy of collective leadership. Unlike Mao, Deng Xiaoping and his successors ruled the country in sort of with power shared among a group of leaders. What's happened over the last 5 years is Xi Jinping has steadily removed and curtailed any other alternative power centers within the party itself. At the party congress last fall, they didn't appoint a successor to him, which you would have expected after his end of his 10-year term in office in 2023. And then just a couple weeks ago, they removed the formal term limits on his role as president, which is a clear signal that he intends to continue on even after 2023.
Another big picture kind of question on the psyche of China. What do you find the morale of the people and sort of the social fabric?
So I think that's an excellent question. And China is a big country. There are many different people with. It's just like the United States. You have a range of different views among people themselves. So just in terms of general national pride, many people in China are proud that their country has stood up after 100, 150 years of being sort of relegated to second or third place in the world, second or third tier rank within the world. They now feel, look, China is actually being taken seriously abroad, and that's a sense of pride. At the same time, many people are also concerned about some of these shifts. There are people who remember an earlier era in China in which politics was much more unstable, and they look at some of the recent developments and think, what does this mean for the future? Within China, the economic development also plays out in different ways. Just like the United States, there are people who have had their lives improved dramatically as a result of the last 40 years. There are also people who have left behind. There are migrant laborers who feel like my life might have done a little bit better, but there are certainly more people who have done incredibly well. You have recent college graduates who feel like their job prospects aren't remotely what they expected. And so there's a real split that's developing in China right now between the people who feel things are getting better, but then also people who feel like, no, it's not getting better for me.
Sounds like us, doesn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
Interesting that you call this the end of an era. The era of reform is over. To those of us in the West, China looks solid and monolithic, and it's masking these weaknesses apparently that you see. Tell us what you mean by the era of reform is over.
Sure. So when I say the end of reform, the end of the reform era, I'm pretty careful. I mean, the term reform in China is nearly sacrosanct. So whatever happens going forward, even if it's major policy reversals, it's going to be cloaked in the language of reform. And if you mean reform is just change happens in any society. So that's kind of, but I think if you're using the term reform era, you're thinking about the last 30 or 40 years in China, which is what we think of as China, post-1978, in which the economy has been growing really rapidly. Ideologically, it's been relatively open to the outside world, and politically, it's been relatively stable. Unlike the Maoist era, you've had norms internally within the party that have sort of made the rules of the game with the one-party system somewhat more predictable. And what worries me now is I see all three of those things beginning to go. Politically, those collective leadership norms, the avoidance of a cult of personality, that's steadily, one after another, those things are breaking down. Economically, the system is beginning to slow. The optimists will say, well, it's just a secular slowing down. It's like other East Asian tigers. It'll drop down to sort of a lower level. The pessimists are flagging things like the buildup in debt or worried about a more dramatic slowing. And ideologically, whereas in the early 1980s, China was very interested in absorbing things from the outside, I'm sensing a closing up in that sense. The party itself is beginning to pivot back to a more narrow definition of what it means to be Chinese, and they're starting to look with more suspicion at a range of foreign influences, both Western liberal norms, Christian house churches, but foreign businesses that have started to come under pressure that they didn't really expect 20 years ago.
You made, I think, a really insightful point that the U.S. tends to fundamentally misunderstand political transition. You cite Soviets when they collapsed in 91, Iraq, 2003, even Egypt more recently, 2011. So is that a statement that we kind of don't understand what's going on in China, really?
I think there's a little bit of that. I think there's in some ways we automatically assume that economic development automatically has to mean that people are going to be more like us, more automatically result in a liberal democratic society. And I don't think that's true. I also tend to think that we believe, Americans tend to think, well, when any time an authoritarian system collapses, sort of the seeds of democracy just automatically spring out. And I don't think that's true either. I think transitions can be very tricky and very complicated. And so, things move forward and move backwards. And I think China may not be going exactly where we hoped or we wanted, but it's pursuing its own, and there's an internal trajectory that's taking place in China. We just have to sort of look and see what's happening, and whether we like it or not, just realize that that's where China's going.
Was the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest, was that, what was the beginning of this ending of the reform period?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. I think there were different key points. that took place. I do think 1989 was one. In the 1980s, the question as to how far China might go with political reform was a little bit more open. There were some serious experimentations with deeper political reform at that point, but by 1989, that was all off the table. The bloody crushing of the pro-democracy movement put an end to that. After that, there was still some possibility for more limited reforms, but I think even those, you saw those begin to peter out by the early 2000s. So it was kind of a slow closing of the door on the possibility for deeper institutional change, and 1989 was a key moment.
Listen to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, listen over the Internet, and access our podcast. Chinese law and governance expert Carl Minzer in our final national segment. Do you see any chance of regime collapse at some point, and any chance that there'll be a radicalization of the people?
So, I mean, there's nothing on the horizon right now that signals regime collapse is imminent. The party has strong control over China. It has lots of resources. The economy is still rapidly growing. So, there are people out there who sort of are the China bears who will say, the collapse is imminent. I'm not one of those people. I don't know exactly what will happen, but the book is aimed at flagging a series of pressures that just seem to me to be building up within the system. So in the short run, it looks to me like this turn towards a more authoritarian, a more hardline approach is going to gradually erode the technocratic capacities of the state. When we were thinking of the reform, everyone thinks of China today, you think of China as being a very effectively managed country. You think of, it's an authoritarian state, but it's well run. And you think, hey, and that's an artifact of the reform era. That's an artifact of the late 1970s, early 1980s, where the party was backing out of everybody's lives. It was saying, we're going to only control the big decisions. We're going to let the technocratic managers begin to run things. We'll let businesses have a lot more leeway to do what we want to do. The problem is, as the power gets concentrated in the hands of a narrower range of people, then you start to worry about bad decisions happening. You worry about things like that big stock market run up in 2015 and then the breakdown, where you had the sense the system was not responding as capably. And I just think the risks of that start to increase as power centralizes even more closely. And as the system becomes more ideologically tight, I think the pressures also start to ramp up on people who used to think, well, politics didn't involve me. You've had within the last couple months now some foreign businesses, domestic Chinese businesses as well, have to issue self-criticisms for things that were on their website if they listed Taiwan incorrectly. And I worry that some of those pressures might also start to build up again. And that starts in the short term to erode the way the system is running. If things really started to become more problematic, might some of those latent social pressures that have built up over a range of, over 30 years, as China has gone through the most extreme social transitions of any country in the world. I mean, the development trajectory, the changes that the United States and Europe and a range of other countries experienced over the course of 200 or 300 years, massive urbanization, huge development, that's all been compressed in China to 30 years. But the resulting political pressures, the social pressures, they've kind of been, the lid's been kept on those because of China's political system. If there were problems that started to emerge, might some of those pressures come out? Now, this, again, I'm not saying, that's everyone wants democracy. I'm just saying that there are a lot of people who are angry or upset or don't think that they got what was deserving to them or are irritated about, government. I mean, there's a complex mixture of pressures that are under the surface there. And I just worry if the political system started to have cracks in it, what might happen as a result. And I'm much more worried than I think other people are about that possibility.
Is there a chance that social media could undermine the authoritarianism?
Well, at the moment, certainly in the late 1990s, Bill Clinton said, there's no way anyone could ever control the Internet. It was nailing Jell-O to the wall. Well, the Chinese nailed Jell-O to the wall. The Great Firewall managed to, they saw media as a problem, and they have come up with an effective censorship system. So I don't think that there are technologists out there who sort of think, the technology will inevitably change. I think that's, the the state can respond to that. I think some of that will just depend on the deeper political shifts that are going on.
Should the U.S. be pushing for regime change? Should we be pushing for getting more of our consumer services in there and working with them? Are they an ally? What are they?
Yeah, I think that I'm not in the regime change ranks. I mean, I think that the United States has to be very careful about becoming over-identified with a particular regime, and I think we also need to be careful about aggressively beginning to try to topple other regimes. I think both of those can work out very negatively. If you become over-identified with a particular regime, including China, then the people who are in that society who are unhappy with their government start to look at you as a problem. Look at what happened to Iran after the Shah fell. All of a sudden, we started to become identified as the person who was closely identified with the Shah. But conversely, if you sort of topple the country, if you sort of aggressively become involved in toppling the government, it may not work out the way you want. You probably don't have that much ability to influence events after the fact anyway. And why would you want to do this? And then you look at what we've just been done in Iraq and Afghanistan, that's very complicated too. So I'm really hesitant to push anybody in either one of those directions. For me, I think it comes down to, first we have to get our act together at home. I think we in the United States have to stand up for our own liberal democracy. I think we're suffering political erosion in our own system. China's one-party system is experiencing top-down political erosion where its norms are coming undone. We in the United States are experiencing bottom-up political erosion as a result of bottom-up populism. And I think first we need to get our own house in order, and we have to stand up for liberal values to the extent that we can, and I think it's by virtue of being standing up for what we represent and speaking about it. I certainly think we can also speak about our how important liberal democracy is. But that's certainly more convincing when you're actually practiced. So that would be one thing that I would encourage us to do in the United States.
All right, we've got a minute to go. Is the worst case that we go back into a Cold War kind of relations and trade wars, and are you overall optimistic, pessimistic?
I'm really worried. I think that, and this isn't just about China. I mean, I definitely think that China is beginning to slide in the negative direction, and I really worry that it's unpredictable how far that can go. I'm worried also because at the same time in the United States, as I mentioned, that slide that we're experiencing, I think that's leading both countries to essentially become more hardline ethno-nationalist. Both countries perhaps becoming a more wary of free trade, both countries becoming more wary of the other, at least particularly in the leadership ranks. And I think that could lead to some real tension between the two countries. In the long run, I really hope that sort of people in both countries who kind of think that openness to the outside, think that exchanges with the other, think that multinational organizations have a role to play. I think people in both countries need to stand up for those values, and it's easier, of course, in the United States because we have a democratic system that allows for that. In China, it's going to be very difficult for those voices to get out in this environment. But hopefully, in the United States, some of us can stand up to that.
Been a sobering look at China. Looks like you're ahead of the curve on everything here. Thanks to Carl Minzer. That book, again, is End of an Era, How China's Authoritarian Revival is Undermining Its Rise. It's just out. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks to Fordham Law's Carl Minzer. Thanks to our national audience for listening. See everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.